So this week, I just want to turn my focus towards the SACP, which received their fair share of media attention this week. One, it was the 104th year anniversary, and the South African Communist Party announcing this week that they are going to officially be contesting elections, the next upcoming municipal elections, as a standalone party and not necessarily in partnership with the alliance partners, which is the African National Congress. And when we think of SACP, it's quite rare that you'll think of SACP outside of the alliance. So I just want to give a bit of a preamble here in terms of what is this alliance, what makes up this alliance of these three giants. Like I said, they've got quite the influence in our political landscape here in South Africa. And within this alliance, you've got the ANC, African National Congress, which I think is more dominant because they are the political leadership. So within the alliance, African National Congress are the ones that are sent off to have members of parliament. They're coming from the ANC, councillors in municipalities, members in the cabinet, right? So that is the political front. But the political front obviously needs some strategy. It does not exist in isolation. The strategic, influential sort of policy direction point of view, that's where you then get the SACP. They are the ideological sort of direction, right? And SACP being the South African Communist Party, keyword communist, basically means that at the root cause of what ANC adopts or what informs the ANC's policy direction is rooted in communism, or at least it's rooted from an anti-capital stance, because you often hear Mbalula coming out and saying, no, ANC is neither left nor right, they're centrist. I think he once made a comment like that. Well, this suggests that it's not because of its ties to this SACP. And lastly, within this alliance, you get COSATU. COSATU is obviously the workers' union, also quite a dominant force. If you look at it in isolation, they have quite an influence. And when you look at this alliance, the COSATU portion of the alliance is often referred to as the pressure group, right? Because now they are looking after the workers, which basically means that if you listen to communists or understand the Marxist idea, their theory is workers are the ones that are going to take over and they are going to overrule and basically get rid of capital or get rid of the sort of business owner and take over everything and become their own sort of capital and own the work, means of production and so forth. So COSATU is looking after that portion, which is basically to cook and make sure that workers are constantly putting pressure. And the ultimate goal of communism, obviously, is to defeat capitalism entirely.
Now, the central crisis in our revolution today remains capital. Who defends capital today? Those aspirant capitalists who have captured the state in the name of the people. That is why, for over 22 years of discussions about the exercise of power in this country, reflected in the debate we characterize as the reconfiguration of the alliance. In essence, that debate was about the exercise of power in this country. We have been dissatisfied with the exercise of power in this country as the Communist Party. We still are, even today. Now we are talking about power that is eluding us, when we cannot even exercise it.
So when speaking about how people don't understand power, right? Here, Mapaila is basically signaling, right? This is very much a signaling that it's taking too long. The overturning of capital is taking too long. He is basically speaking to people who are in the forefront. Remember, the African National Congress is the political front of the alliance. They would be the ones that are in the forefront, right? He's saying it's taking too long. You guys are not achieving the ultimate goal. Because he goes on, even if it's not in this particular take, to accuse them of using things like the National Democratic Revolution to acquire their own sort of gains and have their own wealth and so forth. Meaning, when he says power is not understood, it's just basically signaling that, hey, you guys are not achieving the ultimate goal, which is to get rid of the capital front, right? Meanwhile, SACP celebrating 104 years, it was the 104th anniversary, their goal is still not achieved. that is also an admission when he says that, people don't understand power. It's also an admission that their goal is not yet achieved. In fact, in that time, from when they were formed, 104 years later, which is an incredibly long time, in that time, there have been some really strong signals, right? If now we take history and make history a lesson, if we consider history and what has happened as some sort of a lesson, because I know sometimes with communists, they don't really regard history as a lesson in terms of what not to do. If you take what has happened between when SACP was formed to date, the strong signals that the very policies that the Communist Party supports are problematic have already occurred. Major ones, if you look at the Marxist sort of theory front, you've got the collapse of the Soviet Union or the USSR.
Another important policy for Stalin's first 5-year plan was collectivization. Under this policy, farmers were forced to give up their individual farms and join a collective farm, where the share of crops for each farmer is determined by the state. The main argument was that a large collective farm can use heavy machinery more effectively and produce larger crops compared to many small independent farms making their own decisions. Not only that, but it's also easier for the state to control just one large farm than many small farms. Of course, people resisted this collectivization and it turned bloody. Farmers who resisted were deported to prison camps, and a major famine that killed millions happened in 1932 and 1933. Now, the Soviets did gain a little bit from this collectivization. The agricultural products that they gained by force helped to fuel capital investment in heavy industry, and it helped to cause migration from the countryside to big cities, adding more workers for the factories. But I'm not sure that the benefit outweighed the cost of millions of people dying from famine and oppression. This paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, for example, titled "Was Stalin Needed for Russia's Economic Development?", came to the conclusion that collectivization added nothing to economic development and only caused numerous human suffering.
Then you have Cuba. Also in the 104 years that SACP has existed, we have the absolute collapse of the Cuban economy, which if you look at Cuba today, people are basically, it's a poor country, right? In a nutshell, it's a poor country. The economy is completely collapsed. There's absolutely nothing left of the economy following the very policies that SACP would advocates for, one of them being land expropriation without compensation of not just land but assets. Cuba, which was led by Fidel Castro at the time, expropriated land and property and businesses of US-based companies, and that came with some serious consequences, which is what we know as sanctions. That was imposed on Cuba. Till this very day, Cubans are still suffering because of those decisions. So I think as citizens, as the voting population, right, I think it's important that we acknowledge the power struggle or the power dynamics between sort of this capital view of things as well as the Marxist view of things, because this sort of power struggle is at the center of everything. It's at the center of everything that is politics, right? One side, you've got the Marxists. They relies heavily on mobilizing the masses. So they get masses stirred up because they're also speaking to a very critical thing that us as humans have. Like, if you have to work 12 hours a day, the likelihood that if someone comes and says, well, working 12 hours a day is just not ideal, you're most likely going to react to that. You're most likely going to feel like that person is on your side, that person supports you, because it's just working is not actually natural, just to put it out there. That's why when there's, over time, you find that careers have to align with your interests, your passions, because if that is sort of involved as well, the work doesn't become work. And then on the other side, capital also has a lot of influence on people through the politicians, through sort of government officials. Capital, it's slightly different because they would, capital is pro-profit, so they profit-driven. So they need an environment. It's critical that the environment is in favor of whatever business they're running. So they would lobby people for their own interest. They would fund political parties. And through investment, because now they've got the capital, through investment, that's how they're able to influence the political space. Often not to the detriment per se, because like I said, capital has one agenda, right? Capital was actually not formed to hurt or destroy society. Capitalism was actually a response to a feudalism system, which said kings and queens owned all of the wealth. They had all of the money. They were at all of it that you see today. Capitalism was then a step further to say, no, how about we create a free market type of system where anyone who dares to try can still achieve it without necessarily having ties to a particular family and all of that. Because the problem with the feudalism system is that it was not, if you were not in the right family, for example, you had no chance. But I just want to point out, right, the capital influence in politics is often viewed as very negative. And again, if you listen to Marxists actually deployed the propaganda thing as a tool. It's a critical tool for them because they like I said, their end goal is to get the masses so stirred up that the masses completely reject capital. So with that said, the Marxists, right, which they are the masters of propaganda, just to put it out there, so they often, come up with this thing that no, capital having any influence or any say in our politics, whether it's through investing in political parties of sort and all of that, is negative. And then you have people like Penal the Pen, for example, as prominent of a speaker as he is in our political discourse, he just goes along and says, no, business having investment, business funding parties, that is negative. But we just don't see the same energy when we have to criticize Marxists. We don't see the same energy. And what essentially the Marxists are calling for, which I think is a big problem if you actually look at it closely, they're saying the economy as we know it today, different sectors, companies, industries need to move from the guys that are in charge of those things now, and that must be handed over to them. And what happens if this is achieved, like what Abosoli Mapaila are dreaming of, what happens is that you have Cuba. That is the outcome. The outcome is what has happened with Cuba. And Cuba, one of the biggest problems, apart from the fact that people are struggling, is that people that are born in Cuba have immigrated to everywhere else in the world, right? They're all over the world. And it's just a sort of a badge of honor. I don't know if they call themselves Cubans, but they're not in their own countries. And whatever economic activity that is existing in Cuba is because of the Cubans that are in the diaspora, who are then sending money back to family members and all of that. Same thing with Zimbabwe. So if they eventually achieve what they want, what they're saying they're going to achieve, that becomes the outcome. Yet we do not criticize this in our media. In fact, I was listening to, Tiri Madia, when she sat down with Julius Malema for the interview. And Julius Malema makes a point about how, the only way that the EFF can join the ANC is if the Freedom Front, as well as the Freedom Front Plus, as well as the Democratic Alliance are not in the picture. Of course, from an ideological point of view, the Freedom Front and the Democratic Alliance are non-Marxist organizations. Yet, when he made the comment, as a journalist, Tiri Mudia did not ask the question, but why? But why? If you say Democratic Alliance and VF Plus cannot be in the coalition for the EFF to take part, why? And that is precisely the attitude, right? That when it comes to these Marxist ideas, there is absolutely no challenge. We just accept things and think, okay, cool, that's how it's going to be. Big problem.
And there are those contradictions that are hardened, like our contradictions with capital. Because the source of poverty in this country, the source of continued inequality in this country, the source of unemployment in this country is the control of capital of our economy, even of our state. You have a state that it's every single time serves capital rather than the interest of the public. I was listening even a couple of days ago, the president responding to these tariffs imposed by the US. The first thing he said is that we will have to find a mechanism to protect businesses. He's not talking about how to protect people. That's the orientation that we have. Even throughout COVID-19 and any other disaster that we have gone through, look into how capital has been supported by the state. And look how the people have been supported by the state.
So I must say, I don't understand the comment here when he says Ramaphosa did not consider the people. His first call was to consider the business. I don't get it, right? Because what is the link between the United States and America? Or at least one of the fundamental links between the US And South Africa, of course, there's other things, diplomacy, we share a lot of cultural exchanges and all of that. But the most important is trade and investment. That's why these countries even have a relationship for the most part, right? And in this trade and investment, the critical, the most important aspect there is the business world, right? So it makes absolute sense that when there's pressure coming from the United States, our own head of state in this country, in South Africa, the first call would be to talk to business. That makes sense. And on this issue of United States and tariffs, I just want to make a point that I saw one of our prominent political analysts on X this week speaking about how with the pressure coming from the United States, it's time for South Africa to diversify. Yay! That sounds like a good idea if it was that simple, of course. Because the United States is the world's biggest economy. That is dominance, that is power, whether you like it or you don't, right? And I just don't see how diversifying away from the world's biggest economy would work, at least not at the same rate as what we have seen in the past with relations with the United States. A lot of our industries have benefited. So I don't see how shipping that would immediately work. And I think what I'm going to conclude with saying here is that, yes, capital is still a taboo term. I'm sure a lot of people don't even think of capitalism. They don't even think to look at what capitalism is offering because of, like I said, the indoctrination of this Marxist idea that, hey, because we fall part of this race group, then Marxism is our ideology. The people that are leading the Marxist agenda across Africa look like us. They are our brothers, our sisters. So it's like natural that, okay, cool, we will lean there, but let us not throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to this idea of capital. Because if you look into it, like I said, it was not formed to create exploitation and create misery in society. Capitalism is just merely saying that let there be a way or a pathway for people to make money, right? And the reality is it's no benefit to have a society that is completely stagnant, right? Because that's what socialism would lead to. Communism would lead to that because all of the human potential, all of the ideas, the innovation, there would absolutely be no market. There would be no way for those things to go. Social media as we know it today, those things would not exist. YouTube, as I'm taking part now, that would not exist, right? Because what is the gain? People don't work hard if there's no incentive for them to work hard. Ideas are born from some sort of incentivizing when you know that, okay, cool, this brilliant idea that I have can grow legs and potentially make me rich, right? That's the idea, right? Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it at that for today. Thank you for lending me your ear. Please, before you go, remember to hit subscribe to the YouTube channel. Why not? Even if you don't always agree with my points, hit subscribe if you've watched my videos a lot of times and you keep coming back. It only makes sense. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit like as well on this video. That also goes a long way. It's really helpful. And yeah, the comment section is open. Let me know your thoughts. Yeah, when I listen to these guys talk, it's red flags. They just ring red flags. And just for the simple reason that I was once on the other side where I did not even pay attention to these things. And when you look into it carefully, when you actually go into it with a more pragmatic point of view, to realize that, no, this is not necessarily a good idea. This is not what society needs. Some arguments that they come up with as Marxists, I guess I get it, but it's a really problematic theory that they're leading with. And that's just my take. So I urge people to do the same. Think about it, look into it. And often the times what you find is that the lifestyles that people live, what people hold dear, what people aspire to, just doesn't match the politics that they support. And how is that possible, right? So look at yourself, look at your goals and your aspirations and link or match politics to that. That's what politics is for at the end of the day. Anyway, see you guys when I drop the next video.